Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We're really glad that you're here, and if you'd like to have a little bit more conversation about the topics we raise in the sermon today, you're welcome to join us 4 p.m. every Sunday for a Zoom conversation, and that information and how to access it will be accompanying this video or podcast. Look in the description there. We hope that you take the time to join us so that we can hear what's on each other's minds and hearts. And as we begin today, I'd just like to say Happy Easter. And I promise that I'm going to get back to the fact that it's Easter Sunday today. I'm even going to read the Gospel of Mark's account of the women finding an empty tomb. And I'm planning on saying some encouraging things about what it means to have a spiritual practice in today's world, or at least what that means to me. But I can't start there, because this week we've been witnessing the opening days of the trial of Derek Chauvin. And I've been asking myself, what can it possibly mean to celebrate Easter in the shadow of the United States history of police violence, white supremacy, and systemic injustice? And all this week, we've been feeling anew our grief and our outrage at the murder of George Floyd, even while we're reminded again and again that we live in a society where many people refuse to concede, refuse to even consider that a person in authority can abuse their power. They refuse to agree that all people, including law enforcement officers, should be held responsible for their actions. In their minds, all police violence is in some way, somehow, justified, especially if the officer felt fear for his life, especially, to put it plainly, if the victim of police violence is not white, and especially if the victim of police violence is black or indigenous. On the one hand, as I've gone through this week, on the one hand, I've been hearing arguments that, well, Derek Chauvin is just the bad apple, right? He's the one that's making all the good cops look bad. But if you listen, on the other hand, there's another story that's going around that says a lot about how we have conceived of policing and police violence in this nation, because the defense is building its case that, in attorney Eric Nelson's words, you will learn that Derek Chauvin did exactly what he had been trained to do over the course of his 19-year career. He said the use of force is not attractive, but it is a necessary component of policing. I think that's a pretty startling admission, and if we're honest, we'll notice that those two arguments don't even really contradict each other. We've known since the murder of George Floyd happened, we've known that Derek Chauvin has a violent history, and that at least 18 complaints were filed against him from 2001 to 2020. And we know that Chauvin and 5 other officers shot and killed a man in 2006, and that in 2008, he shot another man twice. That man survived. We know that, in the words of Aaron Corbett, other reports documented Chauvin's involvement in multiple violent and deadly cases of police abuse. That's more than enough to convince me that Derek Chauvin had no business being a law enforcement officer, and that he really likely did make officers around him worse. But that doesn't mean that the system itself is somehow okay, or that Derek Chauvin is uniquely horrible. After all, he remained on the force for all those years, despite the complaints and despite the multiple violent and deadly cases of police abuse. The system is designed to tolerate this kind of abuse and even protect the officers that act violently. This is not hypothetical. Please remember that the system that was allegedly set up to respond to complaints like this, to protect the community from abuse, and to remove officers who violated those standards, kept Derek Chauvin on the force. More often than not, the complaints against Chauvin were closed with no discipline. The system is not innocent. The system has never been innocent. In this case, and like so many other cases, we watch as the defense develops an intricate case of victim blaming. In their presentation, Derek Chauvin is not responsible. He cannot possibly be responsible. He was only acting according to his training. He was distracted by the crowd. George Floyd struggled with an opioid addiction and had drugs in his system. George Floyd had underlying health concerns. The police were only responding to a call and doing the best that they could. It is the courtroom version of he was asking for it, and it is immoral, and it is wrong. It is part of an ongoing attempt to always consolidate power and to ensure that law enforcement officers can act with impunity. As Rashad Robinson of Color of Change explained, this is the playbook from police unions who are paying for the defense, who have injected well over $50 million since 2012 into elections to actually help to dictate what prosecutors and mayors and other folks who are responsible for police accountability do. And this is what they do, he went on to say, in trial after trial, is work to put the community and work to put the victim on trial, to make the victim someone who deserved to be killed. It is a playbook that actually draws on all of the deep levels of the racism, all of the ways in which the system is not broken but is operating exactly the way it was designed, to let police officers off and to put black people on trial, regardless of whether we are victim or perpetrator. This dynamic that Rashad Robinson described was demonstrated in another courtroom this week as we received the news that you might have missed, that there would be no convictions for 3 of the violent, abusive police officers who beat up Luther Hall. There's a little history here we can go back to. Back in 2017, Hall was an undercover police officer observing the protests that had erupted related to the trial of former police officer Jason Stockley in St. Louis. Stockley had been on trial for killing Anthony Lamar Smith back in 2011, and he was acquitted. It was yet another example of failure in a long line of failures to address police violence, and the city rose up to demonstrate and to say, this is not okay. The police responded to a protest about police violence by violently attacking the protesters. And Luther Hall, the undercover police officer, was caught up on the receiving end. The Associated Press reported that, quote, Hall, who had been recording criminal activity during the protest, became separated from his partner while fleeing officers who were firing pepper spray pellets and beanbag rounds into the crowd. As Hall was complying with orders to get on the ground, he was knocked down, hit, picked up, and knocked down again before being attacked with fists, feet, and a baton. Hall said he did not push, fight, or pull away from the officers. He said he was stunned. I couldn't believe it was happening, he told the jury. Cases like these remind us that there are at least 2 different justice systems in the United States, and that Black Americans are especially at risk of being targeted for injustice and oppression. As Congressperson Cori Bush tweeted, if an undercover cop can't get justice, how will the rest of us who have been maced and shot and beaten and brutalized ever get justice? Unfortunately, the bad news didn't stop with systemic injustice in our courts of law. We've also been mourning another week of mass shootings. And just between we were here last time and Friday, between Sunday and Friday of this week, we had mass shootings in Cleveland, Ohio, San Antonio, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, Essex, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Orange, California. 32 people were injured and 11 were killed. In the Orange shooting, we were left with the tragic and haunting image of a wounded woman, now in critical condition, cradling a 9-year-old child. He died in her arms. Yet before we could even process these tragedies, the news called our attention to Myanmar. The coup in February in Myanmar has been met with protests and demonstrations, and the military has responded with violence. The United Nations Special Envoy Christine Schraner-Burgener reported that more than 520 people have been killed, and condemned, in her words, to, quote, widespread and systemic attacks on the civilian population by military forces. Already vulnerable groups requiring humanitarian assistance, including ethnic minorities and the Rohingya people, will suffer most, but inevitably the whole country is on the verge of spiraling into a failed state. The people of Myanmar deserve to know why the Myanmar security forces are allowed to continue to go on extrajudiciary killings, why military snipers are shooting at unarmed protesters, and why they can arbitrarily detain, torture people, and abduct the bodies of those killed. Meanwhile, we were also beginning to get more information about the ongoing violence in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, as journalists and human rights defenders are finally gaining access to those regions of conflict. And that conflict has really deep roots. But last November, a civil war erupted between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. According to at least one estimate, thousands of people are believed to have died, and nearly 1 million forced from their homes, including 43,000 refugees who have fled to neighboring Sudan. The Norwegian Refugee Council said between 140,000 and 185,000 people came from West Tigray over a 2-week period in March. The United Nations humanitarian official warned that there's been targeted civilian killings, over 500 recent rape cases, an increasing number of people fleeing violence, 4.5 million people needing food, and children on the brink of starvation. The list of suffering in this world in just the last few days could go on indefinitely. And it is enough to leave us, or at least to leave me, feeling a little hopeless. Why should we even bother? How do we look despair like this in the eye, feel it in our hearts, and yet decide to keep going? Why do we insist on gathering like we do, week after week, to tell ourselves that justice and peace are possible? Why do we bother to grieve the oppression and violence, celebrate those moments of joy and justice that we encounter along the way, and encourage each other to live like another world is actually really possible? In the Gospel of Mark's version of the first Easter, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome go to the tomb. Since the burial had been rushed in order to observe the Sabbath rest, they return with the intent of finishing what had been left undone. Carrying spices, they go to anoint the body of Jesus for a proper burial. Their grief carries them along. In the midst of so many things that they could not control, they could do this. So they wasted no time, going as soon as the sun rises, as soon as they can, and they meet their helplessness, confusion, and sorrow with compassion for themselves, for each other, for the world. They get up and go. That going was an act of faith. The text eavesdrops on the women's conversation along the way. It says, they had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" It would be easier for such a thought to have kept them at home, waiting for when the conditions were easier or at least clearer, a moment that may have never come. They could have gone and asked for help. They could have just given up, but they didn't. And they didn't wait. They got up and went. In the text from Mark that's so famous and we remember today, the gospel reads, when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, here's the place they laid him. But go, Tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That terror and amazement, that's my favorite ending of all the gospel accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. On the psychological level, I think fleeing the scene is the most realistic depiction I can think of to portray a person meeting an alarming supernatural being who says, "Your recently executed teacher and activist has been raised from the dead." I would be running away too, right? I think that's a perfect rendition of the story. But on the literary level, I love the ambiguity of the unresolved and how it invites us to ask, how will we carry both our hope that love and justice can win the day and our fear that we might fall short? How do we do this? How do we keep getting up and going in a world where we're also constantly grieving George Floyd, victims of gun violence, the people of Myanmar and Ethiopia, and so many more? The women had been forced to face what they thought was their greatest fear. Jesus had died. But what comes next? Will their community also die? Will the hope that their lives and society can change, will that come to an end? Will that hope die with Jesus? But arriving at the tomb, they find that they're shocked with a new set of fears. The stone is already rolled away. Is this bad news or is it good news? Have the oppressors shown up to gloat, or has something new become possible? Is this more betrayal, or is it the birth of hope? And the way the story has come down to us, Jesus' resurrection brings about a second chance. The agents of the Roman Empire had been convinced that Jesus was a threat, and they acted accordingly. Jesus' story, like so many we hear in the news today, is one of authorities arresting him under the cover of night, parading him through one court after another, and then making him a scapegoat for the problems of society. They also, those authorities, made Judas into an undercover agent and turned the community against itself. And the authorities ruthlessly beat Jesus before the execution, which itself was a very public affair, meant to give a message. Don't even bother trying to change the world. The only reward you will get is suffering and death. I think all of those things are elements that we can recognize even today. We cannot forget that Jesus' crucifixion was meant to put an end to a movement, and that's how the Gospels picture it. The disciples were scattered and confused, and the faithful women were on their way to perform their last act of love and devotion for their teacher. The whole community was in shock and grief, and yet, somehow, that small movement of people committed to radical equality and compassion, it was resurrected. They were somehow able to blossom and thrive in the midst of an oppressive system of domination. And that's what gives me hope. In the Gospels, it is not just Jesus who is brought back to life. The whole community of those who followed him finds new life, new love, new courage to continue. All those questions I was asking this week, they lead me here. Working for social and ecological justice, it feels almost all the time like an uphill battle. Most of the time, it's much easier to relate to the story of how the religious and political powers conspired to crush the movement growing around Jesus. Even our victories are drowned out by the constant barrage of bad news, so that on any given day, you can find 1,000 reasons to just go hide in your room. We live in the spaces around the question, who will roll away the stone? And the realization that the stone has already been rolled back. That is the enduring meaning and power of the Easter story for me. When I was growing up, because this would, saying that would be a disappointment for all the folks I grew up around, Because when I was growing up, I was taught that Christianity held all the answers to all of life's problems. More specifically, I was taught that our Southern Baptist tradition was the most faithful version of what it looked like to follow Jesus. And I believed it. I believed it with all of my heart, and I gave my entire life to that commitment. But it never added up. And over time, I started noticing that. I studied history and discovered that not only was the story of Christianity full of both foolishness and wisdom, both violence and extraordinary love, but that every other cultural and religious system's history was made up of that same mix. I studied other faith and no-faith systems, and I found poetry, art, and beauty in every one of them that stirred my soul, even as I found stories of abuse, coercion, manipulation, and lies. No society, at least not that I've been able to find, or system has been immune from that. And the common denominator is our humanity. Our humanity holds that breathtaking potential for both compassion and for cruelty. And what is left for us, and the urgent task for us, is to learn how to live with one another in a way that doesn't destroy the earth and doesn't harm one another. Taking up this task again and again is the heart of spiritual practice, the meaning of Easter for me. And Adrienne Marie Brown has put it into words. She wrote, "Where we are born into privilege, we are charged with dismantling any myth of supremacy. And where we are born into struggle, we are charged with claiming our dignity, joy, and liberation." This work looks different in our different lives and situations, but it holds this one thing in common. It lives on in our humanity, even when it often passes by without notice. But you could have seen it even this week. In the courtroom, we have watched witnesses reclaiming their dignity and reclaiming George Floyd's dignity, daring to call out a system of violence and injustice, and unfortunately with no guarantee that Derek Chauvin and the system he represents will be held accountable. But they got up and did it. Remember, for example, the witness of Charles McMillan, who cried out to Chauvin while the murder was happening, "Get your knee off his neck," in an attempt to save Floyd's life, and who stuck around and confronted Chauvin after the murder because, in his words, "What I watched was wrong." Remember, too, the witness of Cori Bush in 2017, before she was elected a U.S. Congressperson. She had been involved in so many ways, and in this particular case, she was helping lead those protests against the system's acquittal of Jason Stockley. St. Louis Public Radio reported on one of those nights of protest, writing about one of the standoffs that, in their words of the report, came an hour or so after activist Cori Bush took to the megaphone to tell police gathered outside the stadium why protesters keep bringing their message there. She said, "Many in the community do not trust police, and that won't change until extrajudicial violence against Black people ends." She said, "We know you're tired of us coming to Ballpark Village. We know you're tired of protesters. You're tired of us," Bush said. "We're tired of the police killing Black folks. We're tired of the police killing brown folks and trans folks. We're tired of you killing people that look like us." She got up over and over and went. Remember the witness of the people of Myanmar in the face of state-sanctioned violence. According to Maria Stefan, they have led, quote, "a remarkable campaign of civil resistance to restore democracy. Nearly every segment of the population, including young women, civil servants, transportation workers, bankers, members of the Buddhist Sangha, and even some members of the police and security forces, have gone on strike or defected to the opposition to pressure the junta. Tech-savvy Burmese youth have mobilized the resistance on and offline, devising creative tactics and clever messaging to evade censorship and spread dissent. The scope and depth of what organizers are calling the Civil Disobedience Movement, or CDM, have been astounding." None of that takes away the sting of grief. None of that takes away the unnecessary suffering that comes from injustice and oppression. None of that takes away the ongoing work we need to do to bring about a change. But in every case, we can find people who are embodying that message that Adrienne Maree Brown put into words. Where we are born into privilege, we are charged with dismantling the myth of supremacy, any myth. Where we are born into struggle, we are charged with claiming our dignity, joy, and liberation. That is our spiritual practice. The more of us who take it to heart and make it a habit in our homes, schools, workplaces, and communities, the better chance it has to become a reality. To put it into the images from the Easter story we read this morning, even if you are afraid that that stone is too large, that all of this is pointless and hopeless, try to get up and go to the tomb. Try to do what you can do, even in the face of grief and despair. Together, we might find that the stone has already been rolled away, and that it really, really is possible to create communities where justice, equity, compassion, and joy are available not just to a few, but to every one of us, to each and every person. Thank you, and happy Easter.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.